They threw rotten food at fat girl in town square. Mountain man stopped them, but she followed him. They called it market day, but it felt like a hanging. Sun hammered the square of thornwood while flies stitched lazy halos over crates of spoiled fruit. Charity Pemberton kept her chin tucked and her list short. Flour, salt, kerosene, praying to slip through the noise like a shadow. She did not. A voice, beer sour and bright with meanness, cracked across the heat. "Look there, the hogs come to feed." Dalton Reeves, son of a foreman and tyrant by hobby, plucked a rotten tomato from a slop crate and lobbed it. It burst on Charity's cheek, rank juice crawling down her collarbone. Laughter ignited. Someone pitched a black-spotted potato. Another wrenched open an egg and flung its sour heart. The circle tightened. Words, sharper than stones, bit first. Pig, burden, waste. Then the boots came, little kicks that said nobody would stop them. Charity folded in on herself and tasted brine and dirt. She tried to crawl. The ring closed. A boy no older than 12 lifted dung with both hands and grinned for applause. That was when the mountain's voice arrived. Enough! It wasn't shouted. It rolled, low thunder breaking a dry sky. The ring shivered aside as a man stepped through the split like a plow through thistle. Tall, raw-boned hair unshorn, shoulders carrying the hush of trees and the bite of wind, Josiah Thornwood did not have to bare his teeth. His eyes did the work. He shrugged off a bearskin coat and dropped it around Charity's shaking shoulders as if crowning a queen. Then he turned. "You finished?" The question was addressed to every throat that had just laughed. Dalton tried for swagger and hit the wall of Josiah's stare. "Town business," he managed. "She likes attention." Josiah took 2 slow steps, the square shrinking with him. "You call that attention, I call it a pack, and I've scattered better." Dalton swung. Josiah caught the wrist in one hand, turned it, and set the man on his knees without flourish. The boy with the dung dropped it. The laughter died. Josiah looked over the crowd, women with folded arms, men with folded courage, boys with mouths still open, and said, quiet enough that everyone leaned in, "You will not throw another thing at this woman, not while I stand, not after I'm gone." He lifted Charity to her feet. She swayed, then steadied, fingers clutching the coat like a raft. He guided her toward the water trough, kept his back to the crowd, and when Dalton cursed from the dust, Josiah didn't turn. "I've got more mercy than you deserve," he said. "Don't spend it." The market remembered its bargains all at once. Stalls rattled, voices pretended nothing had happened. But the square would carry the echo. Enough. If you're listening to this from Hanoi or Houston, Berlin or Buenos Aires, tell me where the story found you. Because cruelty looks the same in any language, and so does the moment it stops. Long after the square emptied, the sound of laughter still lived in Charity's ears. It didn't matter that the mountain man had stopped them. Humiliation clung like the stink of rotten fruit. She sat beside the creek, scrubbing her hands raw, trying to wash away the memory. Every splash felt like failure. She was 23, though she felt twice that. The daughter of a bookkeeper who died of fever and left nothing but debts, Charity had learned to work for every mouthful of bread since she was 15. She lived in the attic of Mrs. Hornby's boarding house, cooked for the tenants, and spent her wages on fabric scraps and second-hand novels she never finished because someone always needed something. She wasn't beautiful in the way Thornwood demanded. She was soft, round, her shoulders broad from lifting sacks of flour, her face freckled and sun-pinked. The other girls in town called her Chastity, behind her back, pretending it was a joke, though it cut sharper than glass. No one saw how carefully she tied her ribbons, how she brushed her hair at night and whispered to her reflection, "You are enough." When the first tomato struck, she hadn't screamed, not out of strength, but because she'd been waiting for it her whole life. Now, sitting in the shadow of the mountain, she pressed her forehead against her knees and sobbed quietly. The man who had stopped them, Josiah Thornwood, crouched nearby, refilling his canteen. He hadn't spoken since he'd given her his coat. The silence between them was thick, but not cruel. When he finally looked up, she noticed how the sunlight caught in his hair, streaking the brown with copper. "You done?" he asked softly. She nodded, though tears still hung on her lashes. Josiah rose to his full height, tall as the pines, steady as stone. His clothes were worn but clean, his hands broad, the nails cracked from work. He looked like the wilderness had built him, solid, quiet, patient, and dangerous only when provoked. "Thank you," Charity whispered, voice breaking. He studied her for a moment. "Don't thank me. Thank yourself for standing up when you could have stayed down." "I didn't stand," she murmured. "You lifted me." Josiah shrugged. "Maybe, but you stayed standing." She blinked at him, unsure how to respond. He poured a handful of water and offered it to her. "Drink. You're trembling." Her hands brushed his as she drank, and a strange warmth spread through her chest. Not embarrassment, but something quieter, deeper. She hadn't been touched gently in years. After a long silence, she asked, "Why did you help me?" Josiah's eyes flickered toward the horizon. "Because I've seen this before. A crowd that forgets it's human, and a soul too kind to fight back." "Did it happen to you?" He didn't answer right away. "To someone I loved." His voice lowered. "And I didn't stop it soon enough." The ache in his tone silenced her questions. They sat together until the sun began to bleed into the western hills. Then Josiah said, "You should go home before dark." She flinched. "Home?" "To wherever you stay," he said. She looked at the road leading back into Thornwood, the same road where people had thrown filth at her, called her names, spat when she passed. "I can't," she whispered. "They'll never let me forget." Josiah frowned. "Running won't fix it." "I'm not running," she said, lifting her chin. "I'm surviving." He held her gaze for a long moment, then sighed. "I can take you as far as the next town. You can start over there." Charity hesitated, heart thudding. "And after that?" "That's for you to decide." She wanted to ask, "Where will you go?" But the words stuck. He was the kind of man who carried his home on his shoulders, who could vanish into the pines without leaving footprints. As they loaded his wagon, Charity caught sight of something beneath the tarp. Pelts, clean and folded, alongside a few tools and tins of coffee. Everything he owned, she realized, fit in one wagon. "Do you live on the mountain?" she asked as they rode out of town. Josiah nodded. "Cabin by the river, 10 miles north, just me." "Doesn't it get lonely?" He gave a small, humorless smile. "I've made peace with lonely." The trail wound upward through groves of aspen and pine. The air grew cooler, cleaner. Charity pulled his coat tighter and tried not to stare at him, at the way his hands held the reins, steady and sure, or how his eyes softened when he glanced her way. She thought of how people in Thornwood had looked at her, as if she were too much of everything, too large, too soft, too visible. But this man, This stranger, carved out of wilderness, looked at her as if she simply was. As the first stars began to appear, Charity found her voice again. "You said you'd loved someone once. What happened to her?" Josiah's hands tightened on the reins. "She died. I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded. "So am I. That's why I stay away from people. The mountain doesn't die because of me." Silence again, but not empty, heavy with everything unsaid. When they stopped to make camp, Josiah built a fire, then moved to the edge of the clearing. "You sleep near the light," he said. "Wolves won't come close." "Where will you sleep?" He pointed toward the trees. "I'll keep watch." She wanted to tell him he didn't have to, that she wasn't worth guarding, but something in his face stopped her. That night, as the fire cracked and the stars burned like cold embers above, Charity lay awake, listening to the rhythm of his footsteps. Steady, protective, patient. For the first time since her father died, she slept without fear. And when dawn came, and the mountain wind carried the scent of pine and promise, she knew one thing. She could never go back to Thornwood, even if it meant following a man who refused to be followed. The road that wound up toward Josiah's mountain was more a memory than a path, narrow, half swallowed by weeds, washed out in places where the spring melt had torn at the earth. The wheels of the wagon creaked and moaned with each turn, and the horses breathed clouds into the thin air. Charity held the side rail as they climbed higher, her knuckles pale against the rough wood. Behind them, Thornwood shrank into a smear of smoke and rooftops, a stain she was glad to leave behind. The wind grew sharper, carrying the scent of pine and snowmelt. The world above the town felt cleaner, though more dangerous too. Josiah said little. His focus stayed on the trail, his jaw hard, eyes sweeping ahead for loose stones or fallen branches. He had the look of a man who trusted the land more than people. Charity, bundled in his coat, stole glances at him when he wasn't looking. She studied the lines on his face, not cruel lines, but carved deep by weather and time. She wondered what kind of love had left such a scar inside him that even the mountains couldn't hide it. They stopped near midday by a rushing stream. Josiah climbed down first, then offered his hand to help her. Charity hesitated. Her palms were rough, her fingers small compared to his, but he waited, patient. Finally, she placed her hand in his, warm, calloused, steady. For a moment, she felt anchored. "Drink," he said simply, filling a tin cup and handing it to her. The water was ice cold and so clear it felt like swallowing light. Josiah knelt nearby, washing his face in the stream. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, revealing forearms covered in scars, not self-inflicted ones, but the kind that told stories. Charity looked away quickly, but curiosity burned in her. When he caught her glance, he said quietly, "Bear Claw, winter of '78. Then after a beat, before that, Bullet, someone else's mistake." "You've seen a lot," she said. He shrugged. "The world doesn't let you walk through it clean." They shared dried meat and bread by the water's edge. Charity ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to remember the last time anyone had sat beside her without judgment. As they packed up to continue, clouds began to gather, bruised and heavy. The air turned metallic, and soon the first drops of rain tapped against the wagon boards. "Storm's coming," Josiah said. "We'll need shelter." He urged the horses forward faster now, and the sky broke open. Rain lashed down in sheets, cold and wild. Charity clutched the coat tighter around herself as thunder rolled across the peaks. By the time they found a rocky overhang big enough for the wagon, both were soaked to the bone. Josiah unhitched the horses and led them under cover, then started building a small fire with dry kindling from a leather pouch. His hands were quick, sure, sparks caught, smoke hissed, and soon a modest flame flickered between them. "Take those off," he said, gesturing to her shawl and dress sleeves. Charity froze. "What?" He met her startled eyes, unbothered. "They're drenched. You'll catch fever." I'll be fine," she stammered. Josiah sighed. "Suit yourself." He turned away, stripped off his own soaked shirt, and draped it near the fire to dry. The firelight painted his back in gold and shadow, scars crisscrossing the muscle like lightning frozen in skin. Charity swallowed hard and averted her gaze. She tried not to think about the warmth she'd felt when his coat had wrapped around her shoulders, the steadiness of his hands when he'd pulled her from the mud. After a few minutes, her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. Josiah turned back, brow furrowed. "You'll make yourself sick," he said. When she didn't move, he stood, took one of the dry blankets from the wagon, and held it out. "Here." She hesitated again, pride warring with need, but when he said, "Please," softly, almost weary, she took it. He looked away while she wrapped it tightly around herself. For the first time, she noticed his restraint. Not the restraint of disgust, but of decency. He gave her privacy without being asked. They sat across from each other, listening to the rain hammer the rocks above. After a while, Charity spoke. "You said you lost someone." Josiah's eyes stayed on the fire. "My wife, Rebecca." "What happened to her?" "She died giving birth," he said, the words heavy and clipped. "There wasn't a doctor. I rode half a night, but by the time I got back it was too late." The fire crackled between them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded. "Me too." For a long while, neither spoke. Then quietly she said, "You know, she'd be proud. You saved someone today." Josiah's jaw tightened. "Saving you doesn't change the past." "No," Charity said softly, "but it changes the future." He looked up then, and for a heartbeat their eyes met through the smoke. The world outside was roaring rain, but inside that small cave, time slowed. Something unspoken passed between them, fragile and new. When the storm eased, Josiah added another log to the fire and lay his coat beside her. "You can use that for a pillow," he murmured. "I'll keep watch." "Do you ever sleep?" she asked, managing a small smile. "Sometimes," he said, "when I forget not to." She lay down, the fire's glow flickering across her face. Outside, thunder faded into distant murmurs like the mountains sighing. Josiah sat by the entrance, rifle across his knees, watching the last silver threads of rain drip from the rocks. Behind him, Charity's breathing deepened into sleep. He turned once, just enough to see her face softened in the light, peaceful, almost radiant. Something inside him, something he'd buried with Rebecca, shifted. He whispered to no one, "Don't let me fail again." The next morning, the world was washed clean. Mist curled over the trees, and sunlight spilled in slow gold through the pines. As they packed the wagon, Charity brushed a curl of wet hair from her face and smiled shyly. "I've never seen the mountains after rain," she said. "It feels like the world's been forgiven." Josiah didn't answer right away. He simply looked at her, then at the peaks rising like altars in the distance. "Maybe it has," he said finally. "Maybe that's what rain's for. and as the wagon creaked forward into the morning light, neither of them realized that the storm had already begun to change more than just the sky. It had started to wash the dust from two battered hearts. The cabin appeared out of the trees like a secret the mountain had been keeping. It stood beside a river that ran cold and silver through mossy stones, a sturdy structure of pine logs, smoke curling from a crooked chimney. The roof sagged slightly, the porch boards creaked, but to Charity it looked like salvation. Josiah pulled the wagon to a stop and said simply, "Home." He said it without pride or apology, just a fact, like everything about him. Charity climbed down, her boots sinking into the damp soil. The air here smelled of pine, smoke, and something cleaner than she had ever breathed in Thornwood. Freedom, perhaps. The cabin door groaned open under Josiah's hand. Inside, it was dark and cool. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and beside it stood a rough-hewn table, two chairs, a narrow bed, and shelves stacked with tools and supplies. Everything bore the mark of one man's survival, efficient, silent, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Not much," he said, setting down his pack. "It's perfect," she whispered. Josiah frowned slightly, as if the word made him uncomfortable. He pointed toward a smaller room at the back. "You can take that space. Used to be for storage. I'll clear it." Before she could protest, he was already moving, stacking traps, folding old blankets, sweeping sawdust into a pile. Charity stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure what to do with her hands, until instinct took over. She found a broom leaning against the wall and began to sweep the main room. When Josiah turned around, surprise flickered across his face. "You don't have to." "I know," she said softly, "but I want to." By nightfall, the cabin looked different. The windows were clean, the hearth swept, and the table polished with a rag she'd found under the bed. Josiah had chopped wood while she worked, the rhythmic thud of his axe like a heartbeat echoing through the forest. When he returned with an armful of logs, the smell of stew drifted through the door. Charity was kneeling by the fire, stirring a pot she'd managed to throw together from dried beans, salted pork, and a pinch of wild herbs she'd found near the stream. Josiah set the logs down and paused in the doorway. The sight, a woman humming softly by the hearth, struck him like a memory he didn't know he'd missed. "It's not much," Charity said quickly, seeing his hesitation. "Just something warm." He moved closer, sat down, and took the bowl she offered. The stew was simple but good, real food made with care. He hadn't tasted that kind of care in years. After a few spoonfuls, he said gruffly, "Thank you." Charity smiled faintly. "You're welcome." They ate in silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the soft patter of rain outside. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Charity rose early, stoked the fire, and made coffee. Josiah would be gone at first light, checking traps or chopping wood, returning with game slung over his shoulder. In the evenings, they shared small meals and smaller words, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence between them began to soften. One morning she asked, "Do you ever go to town?" He shook his head. "Once a season, when I need salt or powder." "Don't you get lonely?" He glanced at her, a ghost of a smile touching his mouth. "Not until recently." Charity blushed and looked away. That night, while he mended a broken snare, she found an old broom handle and used a knife to carve small patterns into it, flowers, leaves, stars. When she finished, she propped it by the door. Josiah noticed, but said nothing. The next morning, however, he paused by the door and ran a finger over the carvings. "You did this?" "Yes. It looked plain before." He nodded slowly. "Now it looks like someone lives here again." As autumn deepened, Charity learned the ways of the mountain. Josiah taught her to fish, to track rabbits by their prints, to set traps without scaring off the game. She learned to chop wood properly, to tell when snow was coming by the smell of the air. At first, he spoke only when necessary, short, careful instructions. But the more she listened, the more his words came easily. Sometimes he even smiled, small, fleeting things that vanished as quickly as they appeared, but each one lit a fire inside her. Once, after she nearly burned supper, he teased, "You cook like a black bear trying to start a fire." She gasped, pretending offense. "And you chop wood like a man fighting ghosts." He chuckled, the sound low and unfamiliar, as if his voice had forgotten how to laugh. That night, Charity lay awake long after he'd gone to bed, staring at the ceiling. The loneliness she'd carried for years had changed its shape. Softer now, almost tender. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in October, blanketing the world in quiet silver. Charity stood by the window, watching flakes drift past the glass. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Josiah, standing behind her, said, "It's also deadly if you're not ready." She smiled faintly. "You really know how to ruin a moment." But when he handed her a thick fur cloak he'd repaired for her, seams stitched carefully, lined with rabbit fur, she blinked back tears. "I fixed it to fit you," he muttered. "The wind cuts hard up here." She touched the cloak reverently. "Thank you." He turned to the fire, hiding the faint red at his ears. The days shortened. Nights grew long and cold. Snow pressed against the cabin walls, and the river froze at its edges. Inside, the fire burned bright, and life took on a slow, quiet rhythm, survival bound with something gentler. Charity baked small biscuits when she could, using the last of their flour. Josiah repaired tools and tanned hides by lamplight. Sometimes he'd tell her stories, half-remembered tales of men who chased gold and found ghosts instead. In return, she told him about Thornwood, about working in Mrs. Hornby's kitchen, about the women who called her names, about how she used to sit by the window and dream of somewhere she might belong. "You belong here," he said once, surprising both of them. She looked up, startled. "Do you mean that?" He met her gaze. "If you didn't, the cabin would have gone quiet again, and I can't stand quiet any more." Something inside her broke open then, not in pain, but in release. One evening, after a storm had raged for 2 days straight, the chimney smoked and the fire refused to stay lit. The cold crept in through the floorboards, cruel and sharp. Josiah cursed softly under his breath, removing his coat. "Get under the blankets," he ordered. "I'll be fine," she said. He shook his head. "You'll freeze." When she hesitated, he sighed, his voice gentler. "Come here, Charity." She stepped closer, heart hammering. He wrapped the heavy coat around both of them, pulling her near so they could share warmth. For a moment, she stiffened. Then slowly, she relaxed. His heartbeat thudded steady against her back, grounding her. Neither spoke. The fire hissed weakly, snow beat against the shutters, and the world outside disappeared. Charity closed her eyes. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again," she whispered. "You are," Josiah murmured. "You're safe here." She turned slightly, just enough to see his face in the dim light. Their eyes met, close enough for breath to mingle. His hand brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. The moment trembled, fragile as the snow outside, and then passed. He cleared his throat and released her. Get some sleep. But when she lay down that night, her heart refused to quiet. By spring, the snow melted and the river sang again. Flowers pushed through thawed earth. Josiah built a small garden for her behind the cabin, cutting timbers for a fence. Charity laughed as she knelt in the dirt, planting seeds. "You act like you've done this before," he shrugged. "Rebecca wanted a garden. I never built it." She paused, resting her hand on his arm. "Then we'll build it for both of them, her and us." He didn't answer, but when she looked up, his expression said enough. That night, as they sat by the fire, Josiah said quietly, "You've changed this place." She smiled. Maybe it was waiting to change. And for the first time in years, Josiah didn't argue. Spring came late to the mountains, as if the world was afraid to wake from its long sleep. Snow still lingered in shadows, but the trees began to whisper again, and the river ran louder, swollen with meltwater. For Charity and Josiah, life had settled into a quiet rhythm: work, warmth, laughter, and the small comfort of two people who no longer felt alone. Yet beneath that peace, shadows stirred. It began with the letters. Charity found them one morning while cleaning an old chest Josiah kept beneath his bed. Inside, among hunting knives and folded maps, were 3 sealed envelopes. Each bore the same name in faded ink: Rebecca Thornwood. Her heart skipped. She shouldn't read them, she knew that. But curiosity, mixed with something deeper, an ache to understand the man who had saved her, won out. She unfolded one. The writing was uneven, words pressed hard into the paper as though carved by grief itself. "I buried you beneath the birch tree by the river. The ground was frozen, but I dug until my hands bled. I promised I'd never let anyone take your place. If I ever love again, may the mountain swallow me whole." Charity's hands trembled. She folded the letter back carefully, placed it where it had been, and sat in silence. That evening, when Josiah returned from checking traps, she tried to act normal, but her eyes kept drifting toward the chest, and her smile never quite reached her eyes. He noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," she lied. Josiah frowned, his instincts sharp as ever. "You found them, didn't you?" She froze. He sighed heavily and sat by the fire, rubbing his hands together. "You shouldn't have looked." "I know," she whispered, "but I had to understand." "There's nothing to understand," he said flatly. "She's gone." "But you wrote—" "Words of a man who lost everything." His voice cracked just slightly. "And a man who meant them." The silence that followed was suffocating. The fire popped, throwing sparks, but the warmth between them had vanished. Charity stood slowly. "So, you'll never let anyone in again? Not even someone who's already here?" Josiah didn't look up. "I didn't ask you to be here." Her throat tightened. "No, but you didn't stop me either." He said nothing. That night, she slept in the small room at the back of the cabin, curled beneath a blanket that suddenly felt colder. In the following days, the air between them turned brittle. They spoke only of practical things: traps, weather, supplies. Josiah retreated deeper into the woods, staying gone longer each day. Charity worked harder than ever, mending, cooking, tending the garden until her hands were raw. She told herself she didn't mind the silence, but at night she caught herself listening for his footsteps. Then, one afternoon, a sound cut through the valley. Hooves. A horse was climbing the ridge. Charity stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the glare. A man approached, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's badge that gleamed in the sun. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out, dismounting. "Name's Sheriff Harlan Tate. I'm looking for Josiah Thornwood." Her heart clenched. "He's not here. When will he be back?" "I don't know." Tate studied her with a hard, measuring gaze. "You living here with him?" She hesitated. "Yes." The sheriff's mouth twisted into a smirk. "Well, that's brave. You know the kind of man you're with?" Charity stiffened. "I know he's kind." "Kind?" The sheriff let out a dry laugh. "That man's wanted in 3 counties. They say he killed a man down in Boulder Creek." Charity's stomach dropped. "That's not true." "You sure?" Tate stepped closer, voice lowering. "'Cause I got a warrant says otherwise. You best stay out of his way when I come back with men to bring him in." Before she could speak, Josiah's voice thundered from the trees. "That won't be necessary." He strode into the clearing, rifle slung across his back, jaw set like stone. Charity had never seen him look so cold. "Tate," he said. "Thornwood," the sheriff replied, tipping his hat mockingly. "You know why I'm here." "I didn't kill anyone," Josiah said evenly. "You know that." "Maybe," Tate drawled, "but I've got a town full of folks who say otherwise, and a bounty big enough to make me listen." Charity stepped between them. "You can't take him." "Stay back," Josiah warned, voice sharp. The sheriff smirked. "She doesn't know, does she? How you left town that night covered in blood?" "Enough," Tate laughed. "Tell her then. Tell her what really happened to the man who tried to take your wife." The words hit Charity like a hammer. "What is he talking about?" Josiah's hands clenched at his sides. "It was an accident," he said hoarsely. He came to our home. He tried to take her. I fought him. He fell, hit his head on the hearth. I buried him in the snow and left before the sheriff could twist it into something it wasn't." Charity's breath caught. "And you never told anyone?" "I tried. No one listened." He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw fear there, not of the sheriff, but of her. "I didn't tell you because I couldn't stand for you to look at me the way they did." Tate reached for his revolver. "That's enough talking. You're coming with me." But before he could draw, Josiah moved. In a blur, he disarmed Tate and pinned him against the cabin wall. The sheriff gasped, struggling. "Go back to Thornwood," Josiah growled. "Tell them the mountain doesn't forgive men who lie." Tate spat blood. "You'll hang for this." "Maybe," Josiah said, "but not today." He shoved the sheriff toward his horse. Tate climbed on, shaken, and rode off, swearing he'd return. When the sound of hooves faded, Charity turned to Josiah. "You should have let him take you." He shook his head. "If I go down there, they'll never let me speak." She stared at him, heart torn between fear and love. "You can't live your life hiding forever." "I can if it keeps me alive." "And what about us?" she whispered. He froze. "There is no us, Charity." Her chest ached. "Then why did you save me? Why did you let me stay?" Josiah's voice dropped ragged. "Because I was lonely. Because you reminded me of everything I'd lost. And because I'm a coward who wanted to believe I could deserve something good again." Tears burned her eyes. "You do deserve it. You deserve peace. You deserve love." He turned away. "Not me. Not anymore." She stepped closer. You can't keep punishing yourself for surviving." He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his rifle and walked into the trees, leaving her standing in the doorway, shaking. That night, she sat alone by the dying fire, the sheriff's words echoing in her head. Outside, wind howled through the mountains, rattling the windows like angry ghosts. But beneath the fear, a new resolve took root. If Josiah wouldn't save himself, she would. She would find proof of his innocence, bring the truth to light, and give him back the life he'd been denied, even if it meant facing Thornwood again, the same town that once threw filth at her. Because the woman they'd humiliated that day was gone. What remained was someone stronger, someone loved and ready to fight for the man who had once fought for her. The mountain dawn broke sharp and cold, painting the sky in bruised gold. Josiah hadn't slept. He'd spent the night outside, watching the tree line, haunted by ghosts, both living and dead. Every snap of a branch sounded like a rifle cocking. Every gust of wind whispered they're coming, and they were. By noon, the echo of hooves rolled through the valley, not one horse this time, but several. Charity heard it first and stepped outside, her apron still dusted with flour. When she saw the riders cresting the ridge, her heart clenched. Sheriff Tate was at their head, 5 armed men behind him. Josiah emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. His face was unreadable, carved in stone. "Stay inside," he said quietly. Charity shook her head. "No, Charity." She met his eyes. "You stood in front of me when a whole town tried to break me. I'm not hiding while they come for you." For a heartbeat, his gaze softened. Pride, fear, love, all tangled together. Then he nodded once. "Stay low." The riders dismounted. Tate stepped forward, voice carrying across the clearing. "Josiah Thornwood, you're under arrest for murder and obstruction of justice. You resist, and I'll drop you where you stand." Josiah didn't move. "You got your story wrong, Tate. I told you I didn't kill him." Tate smirked. "That's for the courts to decide." "There weren't any courts the last time," Josiah said, eyes narrowing. "Just a rope and a mob." The sheriff's grin faltered. "Enough talk." He raised his hand. "Men," a voice cut him off. "You might want to read this first." Charity stepped out from behind the porch post, holding a leather satchel. Tate scowled. "What's that?" "Proof," she said. Her voice trembled, but she didn't back down. "You accused him of killing a man named Elijah Crane. But Elijah didn't die by Josiah's hand. He fell during the struggle. I wrote to the Denver court last month, and they sent this." She pulled out a folded letter stamped with the state seal and tossed it onto the ground between them. Tate hesitated, then bent to read. His brow furrowed. Case of Josiah Thornwood. Accusation voided. Witness confession recorded. Deceased Elijah Crane, admitted to assault and died of self-inflicted injury during altercation. Warrant officially rescinded. Tate looked up, face pale. "Where'd you get this?" "I told you," Charity said. "I wrote to them. Someone had to." The men behind the sheriff exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered, "She's got the governor's seal, Tate." Tate's hand twitched toward his gun. "You expect me to believe this fat—" He didn't finish. Josiah's rifle roared, the bullet biting the dirt an inch from Tate's boot. "Choose your next words careful," he said, voice low and deadly. Silence spread like frost. Even the horses stilled. Tate swallowed hard. "You think you can scare me?" "I don't need to scare you," Josiah said. "Just remind you that justice cuts both ways. The sheriff's gaze darted between them, the mountain man steady as bedrock, the woman beside him unflinching, letter still raised in her trembling hand. He saw the fight was over. With a curse, he crumpled the paper and spat into the dirt. Fine, keep your mountain. He mounted his horse, glaring down. But don't think this makes you innocent in everyone's eyes. Josiah's voice was calm. I stopped caring about everyone's eyes a long time ago. Tate jerked his reins, and the men followed him down the slope, the sound of their hooves fading into the valley. For a long moment, neither Josiah nor Charity moved. Only the wind spoke, whispering through pine needles like a sigh of release. Then Josiah turned, shoulders shaking with something between laughter and disbelief. You rode to Denver? Charity exhaled shakily. You saved me once. I thought I'd return the favor. He stared at her. This woman the world had tried to destroy, now standing tall against it. Slowly, he set down his rifle and stepped closer. You risked everything. I just wanted you free, she said softly, so you could stop hiding from ghosts that aren't chasing you anymore. His hand came up, rough fingers brushing her cheek. They're gone, he whispered, all except one. She looked up. Which one? The one I made myself. And then he kissed her, not a desperate kiss, but a quiet one, full of gratitude and homecoming. The snowmelt river sang nearby. The wind carried away the echoes of the past, and for the first time in years, Josiah Thornwood felt forgiven. Evening fell soft over the valley. The storm clouds that had gathered during the standoff drifted apart, leaving behind streaks of pink and gold over the mountains. The air smelled of pine sap and new rain, clean like a beginning. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled again. Its warmth filled the space, wrapping around the two souls who had spent too many years in coldness, one from shame, the other from solitude. Charity sat near the hearth, mending one of Josiah's torn shirts. Her fingers worked steadily, the soft rhythm of needle and thread calming her heart. Josiah sat by the window, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a small bird. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It felt like a song waiting for its next verse. At last, Charity broke it. What happens now? Josiah looked up. Now? He set down the carving, his voice low and thoughtful. Now we live, I reckon. She smiled faintly. That simple? He nodded. For the first time it can be. Charity leaned back, watching the flames. Do you think they'll come back? The sheriff? The town? Josiah's jaw tightened for a moment, then eased. Maybe. The world doesn't change overnight, but I don't aim to run any more. She met his eyes. Neither do I. He crossed the room and sat beside her. For a long while, neither spoke. The firelight flickered across his face, the scars, the weariness, and something new behind his eyes. Peace. He reached for her hand, calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. I spent years believing I didn't deserve another chance, he said quietly. But you made me see that surviving ain't the same as living. Charity's eyes shimmered. And you made me see that kindness isn't weakness, that I don't have to hide from who I am. The fire popped. Outside, an owl called from the tree line, its voice echoing across the valley. Josiah smiled slightly. You ever think about leaving the mountains? She shook her head. No, for the first time. I belong somewhere. She paused, then added softly, with someone. He squeezed her hand. Then this is home. Charity turned toward him, her face lit by the soft glow of the hearth. Home, she echoed. They sat in silence again, listening to the fire and the night. Beyond the walls, snow-melt rivers whispered, and the world kept turning. The same world that once laughed at them, now far below and powerless. As the flames burned low, Josiah stood and threw another log into the fire. The sparks rose, dancing like tiny stars. He glanced over his shoulder, voice tender, almost reverent. "You're safe here, Charity." She smiled, not because she needed reassurance, but because she knew it was true. And when the night finally swallowed the light, they stayed there together. Two souls once broken by cruelty, now healed by the quiet strength of love. Outside, the mountains watched over them, eternal, patient, and wild, as if promising that whatever storms might come, this place, this love, would endure. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Every time I tell a story like this, I'm reminded that kindness, even in its smallest form, can rewrite a life. Charity was mocked, broken, and left with nothing, yet one man's courage gave her the strength to stand again. And Josiah, buried under guilt and loss, found his way back to love through the very soul he'd saved. If this story reached you tonight, tell me where you're listening from. The city lights, the quiet fields, or somewhere in between. Because no matter where we are, we all crave the same thing, a love that heals.